moment his mother called me the practical choice, I should have put down my fork and left. But I smiled instead, cut another piece of my roast, and told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. That's what I did for 3 years. I told myself things didn't mean the way they sounded. His name was Brett. We met at a work conference in Ottawa. He was presenting a panel on urban design. I was there representing my firm for a networking session. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they know exactly how much space they take up in a room. He asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. That was the part that got me. I wasn't used to being listened to. I was 34, living in a 2-bedroom condo I'd bought myself in Westboro, working as a senior project coordinator for a civil engineering firm. I had a good salary, a pension, and a habit of watering my plants on Sunday mornings while listening to CBC radio. My life was quiet and mine, and I was proud of it. Brett was 37, freelancing as an architectural consultant, which in practice meant he had 2 semi-regular clients and a lot of ambition he was waiting to act on. He lived in a bachelor apartment in Vanier that he described as transitional. I didn't ask what he was transitioning toward. The first year was genuinely good. He made me laugh. He remembered small things, the name of my favorite bakery, the podcast I'd been meaning to start, the anniversary of when my dad passed. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. And after a relationship in my late 20s that left me feeling invisible, present felt like everything. He moved in after 14 months. I want to be honest about this part. I offered. I was the one who brought it up. My condo was bigger, his lease was ending, and we spent most nights together anyway. It seemed practical. His mother would have agreed I was, after all, the practical choice. The first thing I noticed was how quickly staying here became living here without any of the conversations that should come between those two things. He didn't offer to split rent. I told myself that was fine because his freelance work was inconsistent. He didn't contribute to groceries at first, then occasionally, then only when I asked directly and handed him a specific list. I told myself he was adjusting. He used my car when his needed work. He borrowed from my line of credit once, just until a payment clears, and paid it back 6 weeks later, without the interest, without acknowledging the interest existed. When I mentioned it, he said I was being weirdly transactional about something between partners. That word, partners, he used it like a shield. I paid our bills. I renewed our streaming subscriptions. I booked the flights when we visited his family in Victoria. I organized our calendar, our social life, our fridge. And I kept doing it because each individual thing seemed small enough to manage, and pointing to the whole pattern meant having a fight I didn't know how to win. He proposed 9 months after moving in. We were at Dominion Arboretum on a Sunday afternoon, which, in retrospect, is free to visit, which felt meaningful later. He got down on one knee and the ring was a thin silver band with a small stone in the center. I found out later it was cubic zirconia. Not because I'm materialistic, but because he told his friend it cost him $300, and I heard his friend repeat that figure at a dinner, and even $300 felt unlikely. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I loved him, or I loved a version of him I was still waiting to fully arrive. We started talking about a wedding, and somehow every conversation circled back to what I could manage, what my budget allowed, what made sense given that my income was more stable. He had opinions about venues and menus and flowers, but a recurring vagueness about where his share of the deposit was coming from. His family came to visit from Victoria that spring, and we hosted a dinner at my condo. His mother, Pauline, brought wine and a very particular energy. She had opinions about everything she could see. My kitchen organization, my choice of table runner, the fact that I used cloth napkins. She delivered all of it warmly, the way some people have learned to make criticism sound like interest. At one point during dinner, she looked at me across the table and said, "Brett's always needed someone steady. You're very sensible, aren't you?" It wasn't quite a question. His father laughed a little. Brett smiled at his plate. I said thank you. His brother Nathan was there too with his girlfriend Meg. Nathan was louder and easier to read. He teased Brett the way siblings do, lightly, constantly. At some point in the evening, he made a joke about how Brett had been keeping options open all the way through his 30s, and Pauline laughed and said something about how some boys take longer to settle. Brett steered the conversation somewhere else. I remember feeling a faint unease that I swallowed with a sip of wine. The engagement party was 2 months later. It was held at Nathan and Meg's place in Kitsilano. They'd moved to Vancouver by then, and because Brett had planned most of the guest list, most of the people there were his friends, his colleagues, his university group, his family again. I had my sister Joanna and her husband, which I was grateful for in a way I didn't fully understand until later. I'd assumed there would be more of my people. There wasn't. When I'd mentioned names, my work friends, a couple from our neighborhood I'd gotten close to, Brett kept saying, of course, and then nothing happened. And eventually I stopped pushing because the party was already planned. Joanna pulled me into the kitchen early in the evening. She refilled my glass and gave me a look that I knew. She'd been giving me versions of it for months. You look tired, she said. It's been a busy spring. She didn't push. That was Joanna's way. She planted the seed and waited. The party moved through the usual rhythms, toasts, photographs, the particular noise of a room full of people who know each other well and are performing ease. I circulated. I smiled. I answered questions about wedding dates and venues, and stayed deliberately vague about timelines because the truth was we didn't have any. Not really, because every concrete conversation about dates and deposits dissolved the moment real numbers got involved. It was Brett's friend Davis who said it. We were standing near the kitchen doorway, a loose group of 4 or 5 of Brett's friends. Davis had been drinking since early and had the loosened quality of someone who'd long ago decided honesty was a personality trait. He was telling a story about a trip they'd all taken together years ago, and somehow Brett's name for past relationships came up, and Davis laughed and said, "Well, you always had a contingency plan, didn't you?" What was her name? The one from Whistler? If this one doesn't work out, she's probably still waiting. There was a beat of laughter in the group. Brett looked at me sideways. He didn't say anything. I waited. I gave him a full 3 seconds, which is longer than it sounds in a room that's suddenly gone slightly quieter in one specific corner. He still didn't say anything. Davis, seeming to realize he'd miscalculated something, started to add, obviously joking, but it came out half-formed and then drifted away. I put my glass down on the counter beside me, very deliberately so I wouldn't grip it. I said, "Brett, can I talk to you for a second?" And I said it calmly in my regular voice, which was the only voice I had access to in that moment. We stepped away. I told him I needed him to go back in there and address what Davis had said. Not a speech, not a scene, just something, an acknowledgement. I was standing in a room full of his people, at a party that was supposed to be about us, and his friend had just made me the punchline of a joke about a backup plan. Brett said Davis was just being Davis. He said I was reading into it. He said this was exactly the kind of thing that became a big deal because I made it a big deal. And did I really want to do this tonight, of all nights, in front of everyone? I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about Pauline calling me sensible. I thought about the ring that cost $300 or less. I thought about the line of credit and the groceries and the flights and the calendar and the 4 years of my lease money and the Sunday afternoons I'd spent cleaning a condo we both lived in while he worked on his portfolio. I thought about the conversation last month where I'd asked when he expected his income to stabilize and he told me I had a scarcity mindset. I thought about all of that and I said, "Okay, you're right. I don't want to do this tonight." Then I went back to the party. I found Joanna first. I told her I needed to leave in about 30 minutes and asked if she and Marcus, her husband, could stay close to me until then. She didn't ask why. She just said yes. That's the thing about sisters. The good ones read the room without requiring a full briefing. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I smiled through 2 more toasts. I let Brett's aunt tell me I was glowing. I let his university friend ask me about our honeymoon plans, and I described a trip to the Maritimes that Brett had mentioned once and that I'd researched extensively while he had done nothing practical about. When I said my goodbyes, I was warm and gracious and I hugged Pauline, who said she hoped I was enjoying the evening. I said it had been very memorable. The drive home was quiet. Joanna sat in the backseat with me, Marcus drove, and she held my hand without saying anything for 20 minutes. When we pulled up to my building, she looked at me and said, "What do you need?" I said I needed her to come upstairs and help me think. Brett arrived home 2 hours later. I'd been sitting with Joanna at my kitchen table going through 3 years of shared expenses that I had, in fact, been keeping track of, not out of suspicion, just out of the habit of someone who manages money carefully and who keeps receipts. The number was not small. It was the kind of number that, written on a piece of paper, looks like a relationship rendered in dollars. I wasn't planning to use it like that, not originally, but seeing it laid out changed something. Brett came in, and he was the version of himself that I recognized from other difficult nights. Placating, deflecting, speaking in a tone that suggested I was a reasonable person he was trying very patiently to manage. He said Davis had apologized. He said he'd talked to him. He said I was important to him, and he needed me to not do this. I asked him what this was. He said, make everything into a problem. I said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. If Davis's joke had been about me having a backup, if your friends were joking about someone I was keeping on standby, what would you have done? He said that was a hypothetical. I said I was aware of that. He didn't answer. I picked up the ring from the kitchen counter where I'd set it down when I came in. He didn't notice I'd taken it off in the elevator. I held it for a moment. Then I put it back on the counter, between us, and I said, I think you should go stay at Nathan's tonight. I need to think. He argued for a while. He said I was overreacting. He used the word dramatic, which, in my experience, is what men say when women respond proportionally to things they've done. He said if I needed space that was fine, but he wanted me to know this was going to damage us. I said I understood. I held the door. He left. Joanna stayed the night on my couch. In the morning, we had coffee, and she helped me draft a message to my employee assistance program about accessing counseling. Not because I was in crisis, but because I wanted to think clearly about what came next without the noise of trying to manage him at the same time. The following week, I called my bank. I separated the joint account we'd opened for household expenses, mostly funded by me, and I redirected my direct deposit. I also called a lawyer, not for anything dramatic, just to understand where I stood given that we weren't married and he'd been living in my condo. She told me what I needed to know. I made notes. Brett had moved back in after 2 days because I'd let him, because I wasn't ready to be fully certain yet, but something had shifted in me in a way that I understood was permanent. I watched him differently. I listened differently. I noticed things I'd been choosing not to notice. One afternoon, while he was out, I went through our shared calendar. I found a recurring block every second Thursday he'd labeled work call. When I mentioned it casually over dinner, he gave me an answer that was slightly too immediate and slightly too complete. The kind of answer that exists before the question finishes, which is not the rhythm of truth. I didn't confront him, I just kept listening. 2 weeks later, his phone was on the kitchen counter and a message came through from a name I didn't recognize, a woman's name. I wasn't snooping. It was on the counter, face up, unlocked. The message said, I know you said things are complicated, but you can't just go quiet on me after last month. I went and stood at my window for a long time, looking out at the Gatineau Hills. Then I called my sister. I didn't make a scene. I've seen what scenes accomplish, which is mostly that they give the other person something to manage instead of something to answer for. Instead, I made a plan, quietly, the way I make all plans. I gave Brett 2 weeks' notice. I told him calmly and specifically I was ending the engagement. I needed him out of my condo, and I was not interested in a long conversation about it. I had a box of his things ready. I'd chosen things he actually needed: his laptop, his chargers, important documents, medications, winter gear, because I'm not a cruel person and I wasn't interested in being one now. He was stunned, then angry, then sad, then back to angry. He said I was throwing away 3 years. I said 3 years had been throwing away steadily for some time, and I was just the last one to stop. He wanted to know if there was someone else. I said no, that was true. There was just me, and I'd decided that was enough. He called twice that evening from Nathan's. I didn't answer. In the morning, I changed the lock. I was within my rights. My name was on the lease. He was not on it. My lawyer had confirmed this, and I left his key in an envelope with the concierge with a note saying he could collect it at his convenience. He sent messages. He sent long ones and short ones, and a few that were genuinely sad, and a few that were designed to make me feel guilty, and one that accused me of being cold. I read them all once. I didn't reply to any of them. I forwarded them to a folder and went on with my week. His mother called once. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying she hoped we could talk woman to woman, that she'd always thought I was level-headed, and that Brett wasn't perfect, but neither was anyone. I appreciated that she called. I did not call back. My friend Darini, who I work with, and who had been watching this situation for 2 years with considerable patience, came over the weekend after with wine and a very good cheese board and did not say "I told you so" once, which is the mark of true friendship. We watched a documentary about migratory birds and I felt my shoulders come down from somewhere around my ears to their actual location on my body. Joanna called every few days. She asked practical questions. Had I eaten? Had I slept? Did I need anything? And let me answer however I needed to without performing concern at me. I love my sister in a way that doesn't require explanation. 3 weeks after Brett moved out, I went to the farmer's market near Dow's Lake on a Saturday morning. I bought tomatoes and sourdough and a small jar of wildflower honey. I stood in the sun for a while doing absolutely nothing. I had no plans for the afternoon. I had nowhere to be. My condo was clean and mine and quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in 3 years. I came home and opened my windows and made coffee and sat on my balcony. The city was doing its Saturday thing below me. Cyclists on the path, someone's dog, the particular quality of light that Ottawa gets in early autumn when the maples start to think about turning. I thought about the dinner party. Davis and his loose drinking honesty. Brett's careful silence. The way I'd waited those 3 seconds for him to say something and heard nothing. I thought about Pauline calling me sensible and how for a long time I'd internalized that as criticism, too practical, too boring, too much of a foundation and not enough of an event. But sitting there on my own balcony, in a place I'd bought and paid for and chosen entirely myself, I didn't feel like sensible was an insult anymore. Some people are the event. Some people are the earthquake. Some people arrive in your life the way Davis joked about backup plans, dramatic, unreliable, making promises in the same breath they make exits. And some people are the building that's still standing when they're gone. I redecorated the living room that November. I moved the couch to the window, got rid of a chair Brett had always preferred that I'd never liked. I started watching the shows I wanted to watch without anyone sighing or making comments about my taste. I cooked food I liked without negotiating around preferences. I went to bed when I was tired. Small things, enormous things. My file of his unanswered messages I eventually deleted without reading again. The ring I took to a consignment jeweler, not because it was worth anything. She confirmed it wasn't, really, but because it didn't belong in my drawer. She offered me $32. I took it and bought a good candle on the way home. The woman from Whistler or wherever she was, I never found out anything more about. I found I didn't need to. She wasn't the point. The point wasn't even Brett, really, or his particular set of choices. The point was the 3 seconds of silence when I needed one word from him and got nothing. That's what I think about sometimes. Late on quiet evenings when the city is settling down and the light is long and I'm sitting exactly where I want to be. Not the dramatic moments. Not the confrontation, or the lock change, or the envelope at the concierge. Just 3 seconds. Just a man who thought my steadiness was a resource and my patience was a given and my belonging in that room was conditional on whether I caused trouble. He was wrong about all of it. And I am so glad I finally knew that. I keep coming back to the $32. That's what the consignment jeweler gave me for the ring. $32 for something that was supposed to represent a future. I took the money, walked 2 blocks, and bought a candle that smelled like cedar and clean air. And I lit it that evening in my own quiet condo, with the windows open and the city doing its ordinary Saturday thing below me. And I thought, this is the most honest transaction I've made in 3 years. There's something about cause and effect that doesn't announce itself while it's happening. Brett didn't become who he was overnight. He arrived charming and present, and I opened the door, literally and every other way. Each small accommodation I made, the rent I didn't ask for, the interest I let go, the calendar I managed, the flights I booked, each one was its own choice, made freely. I don't say that to blame myself. I say it because understanding it is the only way I know how to make sure I don't do it again. What I've come to believe is that how we treat the people closest to us is a kind of ongoing declaration of who we are. Brett's declaration came through in small, consistent ways for 3 years before Davis made it loud in one careless sentence. The ring said it. The engagement party guest list said it. His 3 seconds of silence said it loudest of all. He wasn't a villain in the way stories need villains. He was just a person who had decided, somewhere along the way, that my steadiness was something to draw from rather than something to honor. That distinction matters. What I had to find, what took me longer than I'd like to admit, with the clarity to see the pattern for what it was, and then the will to act on what I saw. Those are two different things. I could see it for a while before I could move. Joanna saw it before I did, and she waited. Because she's wise enough to know that telling someone what they're not ready to hear doesn't help them get ready faster. When I finally was ready, I didn't need drama. I needed a box, a locksmith, a lawyer's phone number, and one honest conversation with myself about what I was willing to keep funding with my time and my life. Javrini didn't say, "I told you so." Joanna held my hand in the back seat without requiring anything from me. Those two things, the decency of people who don't make your pain about their vindication. That's what I think about when I think about what goodness actually looks like between people. I'm 37 now. My condo is mine in a way it hasn't felt in years. I go to the farmer's market when I want to. I watch what I want to watch. I cook for myself without negotiating. I don't think I wasted 3 years. I think I spent 3 years learning what I actually require from a partnership and learning that I will not quietly absorb the cost of someone else's convenience and call it love. That knowledge has a price. Mine was $32 and a cedar candle. Honestly, it was worth it.